For this event, I was asked to deliver a 30-minute lecture on lesbian writing. And I must admit, every fiber in my lesbian body resisted it. Of course, I accepted it because it's an opportunity to disseminate my PhD research findings. But I didn't want to feel like I'm defending it again to a panel. So at the last minute, I decided to deliver my lecture in the manner of what I propose here as Pagka-lesbiana. Let's begin.
Today, it is our pleasure to have with us Dr. Joanna Lynn Cruz, who wrote Women Loving, the first sole author collection of lesbian stories published in the Philippines. The University of the Philippines Press has recently published her book, Abi Nako, or So I Thought, the first Philippine lesbian memoir. She's also the editor of the first anthology of Philippine lesbian writing, Tingle. Dr. Cruz joins us today to answer questions about what else? Lesbian writing in the Philippines. Our first question is: do you identify as a lesbian writer? In what ways has this identification changed your literary practice?
I love this opening question. Thank you very much. It will clear the air as well as lay the groundwork for the rest of the session. In fact, that is a classic question in lesbian studies. What is a lesbian? The straight answer is yes, I identify as a lesbian and as a lesbian writer. Because of my PhD research, I've learned that it is important to make a distinction between one's practice as a lesbian and one's practice as a lesbian writer. I've learned through reflecting on my own writing practice that being a lesbian does not necessarily translate into lesbian writing. It needs to be consciously activated and deployed. I also saw this obviously demonstrated when I put together the Tingle anthology of Pinay lesbian writing, with contributors who do not necessarily identify strictly as lesbian, but as queer or bisexual, but who allowed their work to be identified as lesbian writings. In other words, I am less interested in responding to the old question of what a lesbian is, but would rather focus on how is a lesbian. In theoretical terms, my focus is on the performativity of the identity marker. When I think of gender, I think of the ways by which I identify as female, biologically and socially. But I also know that both aspects are constructs in a patriarchal system, which is created and perpetuated within specific cultures and historical periods. Nothing about my gender identity is natural. In fact, I have constantly tried to challenge these constructs or role expectations, even as I do conform to them. Being a feminist, I live in heightened awareness of gender. I am both opposed to stereotypical notions of it and subject to them. While Philippine culture is decidedly patriarchal because of the strong colonial influence of the Spaniards who brought Catholicism to our shores, I see now that the prefix pagka in the Filipino language suggests a potential space for fluidity and becoming. To activate this potential, I use it with a hyphen as a signifier of that space. It is correctly used without a hyphen, as in pagkababae, meaning femaleness, pagkalalaki, maleness, pagkatao, identity, suggesting a state of being, even essence. Used with a hyphen, pagka hyphen babae, it will be detected as a grammatical error, which can thus draw attention to the space of potential. To explore this space of potential, I reference Judith Butler's Gender Trouble and Performativity, which suggests that gender is something we do repeatedly and thus actively create through bodily acts. For Butler, we participate in the process of becoming. We are not necessarily controlled by the culture. The repetitive process of gender construction, quote, emphasizes the discontinuous nature of identity, thus allowing us to locate the possibility of resistance within the process of reiteration itself, close quote. Each time a gender norm is repeated in performance, it allows for variations in the iteration. What this dissonance between a patriarchal norm and our personal interpretation of it highlights is that even when gender normativity seems compulsory, the concept of performativity does allow for a level of indeterminacy and agency as resistance, thus creating gender trouble. For me, as a Philippine woman and writer, the space created by troubling gender can be expressed in my concept of pagka-babae, signified by the ungrammatical hyphen, which turns being woman into becoming woman. The shift in emphasis to the process of becoming opens up a space of potential. I take this concept further in Pagka-lesbiana or lesbian-becoming. American film scholar Teresa de Lauretis' critical work on lesbian representation reveals, I quote, how lesbian writers and artists have sought variously to escape gender, to deny it, transcend it, or perform it in excess, and to inscribe the erotic in cryptic, allegorical, realistic, camp, or other modes of representation, pursuing diverse strategies of writing. End quote. Lesbians have this fraught relationship with gender because of their subject position outside the norms that require heterosexuality. They are autonomous from men because their desire is directed towards women only. This apparent autonomy allows lesbian artists and writers to become more daring in their work because they're not directly subject to the power of heteronormative standards. But because of the way I came into writing in the Philippine literary system, I had not been able to access this sense of autonomy and daring. I was more concerned with gaining the approval of the system. So I passed as a heterosexual writer in the way that I wrote. I was out as a lesbian, but I inscribed my lesbian desire within the heteronormative standards of realistic fiction, which did get my work published, but it also cost me my autonomy as a lesbian. In a similar manner, as De Lauretis points out, I posit that in my book of stories, Women Loving, which contains my genre compliant narratives about my lesbian experience, and which I myself identify as modes of passing as heterosexual in order to gain the associated privileges, I can still assert my lesbian subjectivity through the notion of Pagka-lesbiana or lesbian becoming, a space of potential for disrupting either gender or genre norms, or both. For instance, the fact that my stories revolve around the development of central lesbian characters in narratives that do not end in a heterosexual marriage or death, resisting narrative closure, can be a basis for claiming my stories as spaces for lesbian becoming, more or less. Furthermore, the fact that in the Filipino languages, there is no word for lesbian can allow the Filipino lesbian more room for polysemy around our identities. We can call ourselves what we like, and we do not have to subscribe to the classifications in place in the English-only speaking world. Through the dynamic construction of identity suggested by Pagka-lesbiana, I can validate my sexual identity as a lesbian outside of the closed binary butch femme or the Filipino binary tomboy babae. For a lesbian writer, this space of potential for becoming is found in textuality. With my various efforts to stretch myself in the form of the essay and the memoir, I explore how my lesbian subjectivity can be embodied in my writing. American scholar Marilyn Farwell asserts that the lesbian as a subject in the 20th century represents the woman who, quote, exceeds discursive and narrative boundaries. She adds that in general, I quote, the metaphoric lesbian subject stretches the narrative boundaries by the tension it creates between form and content, between the conventional system and its text images. End quote. Thus, Pagka-lesbiana can show up in writing as linguistic and non-linguistic interventions, which stretch our conventional expectations of the literary genres. For example, in the spirit of exceeding boundaries as a lesbian writer, one way that I have explored this tension between form and content is through the techniques of the braided essay, in which the conventional single point structure of the essay as a genre is challenged. The braiding is inflected as lesbian when a lesbian writer uses it. We're not reinventing the wheel of non conventional literary techniques. We are lesbianing it. And it is a process that is parallel to how each Philippine lesbian becomes lesbian, as asserted in her Pagka-lesbiana.
Wow, that was a mouthful. So much to consider. Let's see the next question. Can you briefly discuss how your pagka-lesbiana is demonstrated in your book, Abi Nako, or So I Thought?
Abinako, or So I Thought, is a memoir of my first 10 years in Davao City after my heterosexual marriage ended and I left Baguio City to start over. The title suggests that this process of rebuilding was defined by my abinako or akala ko, my false expectations of myself, my mood, and my relationships, and how I used my writing to overcome these many shatterings of spirit. That's also why I had to write it, to build and rebuild. That's why one of the chapters is a nest of words written in my own hand as a mandala, and another is a word collage of a house made of cut up pieces from a printout of a chapter. One of the unique ways in which I deploy my pagka-lesbiana in my nonfiction is through what I call playing dress up, putting a different dress on the genre of the essay by borrowing different forms as part of my exploration of my practice of nonfiction. In the first edition of the Creative Nonfiction Manual, Tell It Slant, Miller and Paula break down the lyric essay into four main categories: prose poem, collage, braided essay, and a form they call a hermit crab. The hermit crab essay, I quote, appropriates other forms as an outer covering to protect its soft, vulnerable underbelly. Close quote. For example, poetry, fiction, or more mundane forms like a mail order catalog, a table of contents, an index, an itinerary that might work as the right container for your elusive material. The hermit crab essay is similar to my concept of playing dress up in the essay form, although when I wrote my creative work for my PhD, I hadn't yet read this manual. The difference lies in the intention. The hermit crab essay appropriates other forms, which means taking and transforming them for one's own purposes, just like the real hermit crab that steals a shell because it doesn't have its own home. That makes the essayist a kind of villain. My dress up is done in the spirit of play, only borrowing the form for the nonce, dancing in it, and then returning it after use. I don't see it as a container for my material. I see it as a dress. If I remove the dress, the form I borrowed would remain intact. An example of this approach is the epilogue, Directions for My Care, which is dressed up like a legal document. I braid the terms of the legal document with lyrical paragraphs evoking the past. With the lyrical paragraphs removed, I do use the same notarized document as directions from my care in the event of my death.
With these specific examples from your own writing practice, the concept of Pagka-lesbiana does become clearer. Let's take the next question. Which part was the most difficult or challenging to write?
The most difficult thing I did in this book was trying to write against everything I learned in the writers' workshops and my De La Salle University MFA about writing what was then called creative nonfiction. I had to break out of my own need to be accepted, to pass in the heteronormative Philippine literary system in order to find my lesbian voice. And that most difficult challenge was also, in fact, the most pleasurable. What Kazim Ali calls the riot that comes from the explosion of narrative or the disorienting text. I took pleasure from finding my own ways as a Philippine lesbian to achieve this breaking out of the narrative mode of the essay through, for instance, and most obviously, introducing graphic elements. A major graphic element that expresses my process of lesbian becoming is the tarot artwork collaboratively created by me and lesbian artist Emiliana Campilan. Part of me is still afraid that these lesbian interventions will not be accepted by the mainstream, but a bigger part of me really doesn't care anymore. I do not want to pass anymore. I must be seen as a lesbian writer.
That's a surprising insight. Next question. As the editor of the Tingle Anthology of Pinay Lesbian Writing, how did you define lesbian when you selected the works to be included in it?
At the outset, when I issued the call for submissions, I let the potential contributors decide for themselves whether they identified as lesbian. That is, woman loving woman. Because it really is a personal decision to use or not use labels. I remember being furious with a former partner who labeled me bisexual in her published writing because I have had relationships with men. It was disrespectful of my own choice to identify as a lesbian at that point. But that experience made me more sensitive to other people's choices about what to call themselves. So when I asked specific writers to contribute to Tingle, I also asked them for permission for their work to be identified as lesbian writing. While I'm not privy to their decision making process, I'm glad that all of them gave consent with their specific gender identity and sexual orientation indicated in their biographical notes. Besides, the only writing prompt for the anthology was, what makes you tingle as a lesbian? And I think that excludes those who are not acquainted with that tingle. Then I shaped the book according to the contributions. It was quite a pleasurable experience for me, a collective tingle.
Truly such a groundbreaking and important book. Congratulations to all the fabulous contributors. I think we have time for two more questions. As a lesbian writer, do you have an image of who your ideal reader is? The person whom you implicitly address in your writing?
Yes, definitely. When I write, it is a love letter to this ideal lesbian who is inside me in my longing. Elizabeth Mies calls this ideal lesbian L. Nicole Brizard asserts, I quote, writings make sense that begin with a declaration of love, end quote. As in love letters, Brizard describes the ideal lesbian as the aerial woman, the one who, I quote, orients her desire and focuses her vision, end quote. She is the motive and the subject. For Brazard, she is a double, the object of desire and the channel for the passion expressed through writing. There can be no lesbian writing without this beloved. We are writing to get her attention, to make her love us. She's also the one who knows how to read, whose knowing, I quote, induces recognition, complicity, and possibly desire, end quote. It is the woman's lesbian gaze that sees and desires the other woman. In a lesbian relationship, one is always the other woman, complicit in the illicit. For me, she is the one that got away, as well as the one I've been waiting for all my life. An ideal that is always elusive. I desire her, write to her and for her. But I also know that she does not exist in the physical world. She is, as Brazard puts it, Ariel.
And now for our final question. Why does it matter for Philippine lesbian writers to come out?
While it is true that coming out is a personal journey that only the individual can determine for herself, it remains as urgent before as it is today in the context of the pandemic. But obviously, compared to gay writers, lesbian writers have not been as out with our writing as a collective. We have much to catch up on. But it's not just about writing or publication. Queer writers contribute through our writing to our visibility and legitimacy as a community so that we can help fight for SOGI equality and the passing of the anti discrimination bill, which will redound to change on the ground where it is most needed. As a lesbian writer in the time of Duterte, I have also grown in my appreciation of my role in the political life of the country. Staying silent or neutral helps the oppressor, as Elie Wiesel famously said. As queer writers, coming out is crucial so we can fight our particular battles for our rights, but we must also fight within the larger context of other oppressed groups in our country, indigenous peoples, farmers, workers, the poor. The pandemic has made this oppression even more stark and urgent. Ultimately, we are fighting for our lives.
And that ends our one on one interview with Joanna Lynn Cruz. Thank you for joining us in Bida ang Lesbiana at the Iloilo Mega Book Fair 2021. Padayon!